Hello, friends. Welcome to Regarding Men, where we hold men in high regard and where red pill isolation comes to die. I knew I was going to mess up this morning. Feeling nervous for some reason.
Blue pills
Uh,
die too.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
maybe, yeah. Yeah, blue pills die for sure.
There you go.
I'm Janice Fiamengo, the tongue-tied Janice Fiamengo, and I'm joined here with my friends Tom Golden and Paul Elam. Tom Golden of Men Are Good
Men are
and
good.
Paul Elam of paulelam.com. And today we're talking in a general sense about masculinity studies and the influence that it has had on psychotherapy, counseling. And we're looking in particular at a TEDx talk by a fellow named Dr. Andrew Smiler that both Tom and Paul know something about and have had interactions with. And so I'm going to give a little introduction to Dr. Smiler, and I'll give a brief overview of the talk that he's given. It's just about an 18-minute talk, and then we're going to look at some clips and comment on what he has to say about masculinity and how it should be reformed. Dr. Smiler is, I've written down his details. He's a licensed therapist. He has a master's degree in clinical psychology, and he has a PhD in developmental psychology. He has published 3 books. One is called Challenging Casanova, Beyond the Stereotype of the Promiscuous Young Male. This is a real interest of his, and I find it quite fascinating and provocative, actually. Other books are Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. I don't recommend any teen boy read that. And Is Masculinity Toxic? That's the title of his 3rd book, A Primer for the 21st Century. So he's given a talk about the challenges facing teen boys in particular in the 21st century. And he outlines different types of what he calls social constructions of masculinity. And he starts with a reference to a boy that he counseled in therapy, a 15-year-old boy named Mike, who got himself in trouble in school and lost a lot of his friends and reputation because he shared some nude photos of some of his girlfriends online. It's an odd anecdote in the sense that it wasn't clear to me how he got the photos. I'm presuming that the girls must have shared these photos with him, which he then shared. One would think then the girls would have some responsibility for the proliferation of their nude photos online, but that, of course, is never talked about. It's all about the boys' complicity in these negative stereotypes of masculinity. So he goes through basically 3 different forms of masculinity. He talks about masculinity as a social construct that is hierarchical, that is brutally competitive, in which all men compete to have what he calls hegemonic masculinity, which is a dominating and oppressive form of masculinity. He says that it is most clearly exhibited, especially in a teenage boy's world, in the jock, who is tough, who is competitive, who objectifies women, who doesn't show feelings, etc. Then he talks about other types of masculinity, those who are in second place, who exhibit what he and other masculinity scholars call complicit masculinity. These are men who are not quite at the top. They do not have that dominant form of masculinity, but they hope to benefit from its perks, and they are complicit in reinforcing it as a value. They are complicit in that system of masculinity. Then he also talks about those guys who are at the bottom of the masculinity hierarchy. He says that they exhibit something called subordinated masculinity. These are, for instance, nerds, emo guys, those who have what he calls soft masculinity. They also are complicit. They also support the system, but they realize that they are at the bottom of it. He also mentions that there are some men who are, he mentions particularly black men, as he gives an example of Colin Kaepernick, allegedly somebody who is not allowed to compete for masculine status at all, which I found truly bizarre. But yeah, he's signaling his politically correct race consciousness. Anyway, so I'm not sure if it's even worth discussing his very politically correct take on racial issues. That's not a focus of the presentation. So basically, his point is that for teenage boys, masculinity is this brutal social construct that does damage to women and girls, of course, but also does damage to boys and men. We know that that's the standard sort of talking point of masculinity theorists. And he ends by saying that we need to choose different models of masculinity. He ends with a kind of anodyne statement that I don't think anybody would particularly disagree with, by saying that rather than caring about being a real man, which is part of this masculine ideology of hegemonic masculinity, rather than caring about being a real man, men should try to be good men. And so he had counseled Mike to get in touch with parts of himself that had been valued by his girlfriends, but that he himself had devalued, such as his loyalty and his compassion, so that he should focus on being good rather than being a real man. And I think that's pretty much how he ends. Do you think that's a adequate summation of
more than fair? More
Absolutely.
than fair.
You know, I was struck initially watching this, and I want to sort of get away from the content of what he was saying. We're going to address more of that later. But first, I want to talk about his physical presentation in that video. And you know what it reminds me of? Because you can see as he's standing there, he's not comfortable. He's turning his head to read every couple of seconds because he hasn't rehearsed his speech. Doesn't know. I think probably may not be able to do that. But you know what he reminds me of more than anything else?
Tell us.
Is he reminds me of me at about 15 years old trying to talk to a girl.
Interesting. He's very
That's the
rigid.
feeling I got.
He's very
Uh,
rigid. It's like a
yes,
ramrod
very
is
rigid.
up his back, you know?
And
And there's no
he's
spontaneity.
his hand has like sort of weird jerky movements
Yeah,
to it,
yeah. It's a good point.
trying to add to what he's saying. But I remember, and I think most adolescent boys go through a period where they play out in their mind, I'm going to go up to this girl and I'm going to talk to her, and here's how it's going to go, and this is
Right,
what I'm going to
right,
say. And
right.
we play these tapes over and over and over again, trying to get up the nerve to go talk to a woman,
Yep.
to a girl, and to get her attention. And that was the feeling I was just overcome by watching him. And he is talking to girls. This is his
Huh.
speech to girls about what a great man he is, about what a good person he is,
Huh.
and how he's not like all the other men. You know, Alison Tiemann wrote an amazing piece years ago called "The One Good Man,"
Yes.
and talking about how male feminists and white knights in general take on this persona that we're the good one, we're the one that you can trust, we're the one maybe that you could even love, and that is just
I'll finish it for him. That is just dripping from Andrew Smiler as he presents. And it's so true. And, you know, not only is he, I think that's a really great
dripping.
point. You're back, Paul.
Oh, good.
I, I'm glad I'm back. I seem to have froze up there for a minute, but that's the point I want to make before we get into the meat of what he's. And there's a lot to pick
Oh,
apart
man.
in what he's talking about. The first thing I want to say is this looks like an insecure schoolboy to me
Yeah.
doing a presentation, trying to impress, and for me, it just didn't work. I
Yeah.
mean, the insecurity overrode anything he had to say, and then when you look at what he had to say, oh my God, it's
Yeah.
abysmal.
Pretty bad. Pretty
Yeah,
bad.
I have to say, I had the exact same thought at first. I mean, I watched this a number of times trying to figure out what points I wanted to make about it. And about the third time when I watched it, I was almost brought to tears by the awkwardness
Hmm.
of his physical being. It
Hmm.
seemed he just seemed to me, and his face too. It's often all sort of, I don't know what the word is, even kind of puckered up. He
Tight.
looks, yeah, like he
Yeah.
looks as if he's in pain, and it could just be nerves. I mean, I empathize
Right.
with that. I often feel nervous when I'm giving presentations, but after 20 years of doing it, but he looked like he was deeply uncomfortable with himself throughout the entire talk, and
Yes.
he just looked like a very unhappy person talking, and perhaps this discussion about Mike and Mike's longing for social acceptance and his failing attempts to gain it. It almost sounded like he was speaking about himself, and
Yeah.
it was actually quite painful to watch.
Yeah. That's
It
interesting.
was. I felt the same thing, Janice. I
Hmm.
felt just a wave of almost pity. And I've spent a lot of time looking at Smiler's work and not liking it and seeing um, really the evil side
Yes.
of so many male feminists.
Yes.
But this gave me sort of a pathetic look
It was sad in a
at
way. It's
look
true.
how sad this is.
Yeah.
Uh, for this
And
guy. And of course, I'm sure he would deny it because
of
he's
course.
got it all together. That's why he had to read his presentation, and that's why he looked like a corpse that had strings attached to one hand
And
while he talked.
before we go any farther, let's give people a sense of who this fellow is and what he thinks of men's rights advocates.
Mm.
Because
Yeah.
here's a quote from one of his books. Men's rights advocates, individuals who advocate for a version of masculinity characterized by misogyny, heterosexism, and the use of violence in support of their principles. So that's who we're talking about today, folks. That's who we're talking about. He says that
And this is
MRAs
the
are
evil
violent.
part.
What's that?
Yeah, and that's the evil part. That's what
Yeah.
the writing of Smiler over the years, the work he's presented, uh, really that gave me my longtime impression of him that changed a little bit to a little more, I guess, sympathetic watching this video talk.
Huh?
But yeah, I want to point out one thing. Again, we titled this Why Men Can't Trust Psychotherapy. And I want to say from the outset that it's largely because of men like Smiler that we can't trust psychotherapy very
Right.
much.
Right.
But I want to use one example. He talked about a character in this from Breakfast Club named Andy.
Right.
And Andy was in detention in that movie because he had assaulted one of his fellow students and taped his cheeks together. And Smiler uses this as an example of toxic masculinity, that this is what this was about. But apparently, he didn't even watch the fucking movie because that character was acting out abuse he was experiencing at home. That was the whole
Huh.
theme of his character, was that he was chronically abused at home, and he came to school and exploded in anger one day and did that. Now, a real psychotherapist, anybody interested in therapy, for pity's sake, would have looked at the family situation and they would.
Uh-oh. And they would have been able to look at and see that there's a connection between his home life and what happened at school. By George,
have
how
had.
about that?
And thank you for finishing for me for now. And feel free, both of you can actually you finish. But yeah, this is just one tiny example out of this 18-minute talk that you can tell this guy's not interested in psychotherapy. He's not interested in looking at men and analyzing where their problems come from and
Right.
helping them find solutions. He's interested in his gender politics
And his
and
theory.
painting that. I guarantee you, this guy paints his ideology onto his clients and
Sure.
acts this out in real life. And it's terrible. I hate seeing this. We have a
Yeah.
word for it. It's called pathogenic therapy,
Yeah.
where the therapist acts out their own issues in the therapy. And you see this, man, in this basic analysis of a character from a movie,
Hmm.
Smiler reveals where
Hmm.
his core is at. And it's pretty damn disgusting,
Yeah.
actually.
Pretty bad, eh?
Yeah, I didn't remember that. I did see
I
The
didn't either.
Breakfast Club 30 years ago. I did see it, but I didn't remember that about it. But that's a very good point. Wow.
It is.
And
It
and
all's
we
good with
often,
movies.
yeah, good for you. I mean, we often in our discussions use that the term projection to talk about the what feminists project onto the masculinity that they create. Their criticisms of masculinity are often, in fact, criticisms of themselves, or
Yes.
not criticisms of themselves, but are their own projections of their own issues that they've denied and repressed, and now claim to see in men. And I can't help but think that that is what's going on to a certain extent
Yeah.
with Dr. Smiler too,
Yeah.
because it's very worrisome. And Tom, I don't know if you want to talk now or whether you want to leave it till later about your own experience being actually ejected from the APA
Well, the
by
APA
that.
mailing list for the Division 51, which was the discussion group for men and masculinity. And yeah, they threw me out, and they threw me out because they said I was hostile. But anybody who knows me scratches their head and said, "You? What?"
Yes, Tom Golden. That's the first word that comes to my mind when
Yeah.
somebody says Tom Golden. I think,
And all of my messages are still on that list. Anybody who wants to, who's on that list, could search the list and look at all the messages I have, and let's play Where's Waldo and find the hostile message. Let me see it. But anyway, yeah,
you
Smiler was a
gotta
big
quit.
part of that. He was president of the division, I think either before or after I was there. I forget what, but it wasn't just him, it was all of them. And they all have this tunnel vision idea about masculinity is totally socialized. That's the only thing it
Yeah.
is. It's totally socialized.
Mhm.
And I would mention testosterone, and everyone would go into a panic.
Yeah.
I mean, anytime and geez, I mean, any kind of biological stuff, immediately what they do is I'd say, well, how about testosterone being involved? They would say,
Yeah.
you're a biological determinist
Right.
because I mentioned it. Anyway, so that's enough about that. Let's talk about Smiler. Should we play the first clip?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, let's play that first clip and see where we go.
In the world of masculinity scholars, and yeah, that's a thing, we talk about jocks as having the hegemonic form of masculinity because it's presented as the ideal form of masculinity. Now, as the people at the top of the masculinity pyramid, jocks get certain perks. They get high status and the ability to influence others. People want to be liked by the jocks, or at least be on their good side. Jocks can also get the benefit of the doubt from other kids and from the adults around them. In theory, jocks also get access to the most attractive dating and sexual partners.
I've got to throw in one thing here before we dig into that bit of
Throw it.
from him. The term hegemonic masculinity, it was coined by an Australian gender studies individual named Raywin Connell. And Raywin Connell used to be Raymond Connell until Raymond had his balls and penis removed surgically because of gender dysphoria. And one of the things that we know, and this is just one little corner of the male gender studies crowd, is that people with gender dysphoria hate everything about their bodies that represents the sex they were born with. They hate their genitals. This is part you can look up. I'm not making this up. This is part of the diagnostic criteria. So we have a term there coined, hegemonic masculinity, or the dominating top alpha slot, which is they're making up names for stuff we already have names for. But this came from an individual whose mental condition specifically lent them to hating men and masculinity. And how do we just ignore that when somebody comes up as an expert in masculinities, which I think that's a bullshit term to begin with. We could get more into that later.
Yeah.
But how seriously are we supposed to take somebody? Now, again, I wouldn't wish gender dysphoria on anybody. I can't imagine how horrible that must be to wake up every day feeling like you are not the sex that you were actually born with.
Right.
And having the internal struggles that go with that. I have a lot of compassion for that. But I have to call out some bullshit here. We should be taking anything Raywin Connell has to say with a grain of salt. There's bias there that you can't ignore. There's pathology there that you can't ignore. And it is shaped, and the male gender studies crowd has absorbed this like it's a holy mantra. And it's just amazing. So I wanted to point that out first. That term is questionable to begin with.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that one.
Very good point. And again, as Tom just said, the total denial that biology plays any role in the creation of a competitive hierarchy amongst men. It's just, you had something, Tom, too, that you had found a statement, I think, by Andrew Smiler about how MRAs tend to, completely, all biology is everything for us. I wonder if he wrote that because he was thinking of you and your participation in that discussion list. But and he's we refuse to accept that men should change at all, because we say that this is simply how men are because of biology, and therefore we celebrate male violence, etc. I mean, that's a complete twisting of what any men's advocate has ever said. It has nothing to do with that. It is I'm not an expert, but obviously the recognition that biology underpins the expression of masculinity doesn't mean that people don't care about men's behavior or modeling, the best of men, or dealing with destructive behaviors or anything like that. It's simply a recognition that there is such a thing. And it's amazing to me the purchase that this idea of social constructionism has had on these supposedly scholarly studies, when we know the science is, it's unquestionable that there is such a thing as biology. And yet they think that by denying that, they can simply remake gender expression at will. The danger of that and the uselessness of it is just appalling. And of course, also here, he's denying the role that women play in enforcing dominance hierarchies.
That's huge.
The thing that stood out for me at the end of that little clip, when he says that men who exhibit hegemonic masculinities have access in theory to the most desirable dating and sexual partners. I bet he put that "in theory" in there just so he could kind of wiggle out of actually admitting that is true, and that plays a role in why men, compete for dominance. Because yes, women choose those men.
Yes.
If women didn't choose those men, if they chose a different sort of masculinity, then men would be different.
Overnight.
I find it particularly interesting that he seems to take the line that we believe that men should not change in any way, form, or fashion. All we talk about in the men's movement is men changing. It is the absolute focus of everything. We encourage men to examine their own gynocentrism and how it impacts their lives. We encourage men not to find their self-worth and their self-value in the eyes of a woman. We encourage men to learn their values and their boundaries and to put them into practice in relationships where typical blue pill relationships require men to surrender their values.
Yes.
All we talk about is men changing.
It's true.
And this just like it flew over his head.
Yeah. Oh, no, it doesn't. He doesn't like the way that you talk about how men should change. He thinks that men should be more fully gynocentric.
Yes. In fact, one of the things in Division 51, one of the things they talked about was that, the world will change as soon as men can start acting more like women. Yeah. I mean, it's the truth. That's what they said. Literally, that's what they said.
What did Janice just say? More gynocentrism?
Yes,
I mean, that's exactly right.
exactly.
Crazy, crazy
Crazy,
stuff.
crazy.
Okay, let's go on to the next
Next
clip.
one, number 2. I think.
But if we imagine that boy is poor in rural America, then we're probably imagining a white boy. We might call him a redneck. Your own perspective will determine if that term's positive or negative.
Okay.
Well, you did say this was number 2. Well, yeah, it qualified.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to give it to him in the sense that, I think at least here he's trying to move the discussion of masculinity of white boys into a slightly more positive direction. I think, much of what masculinity theorists like Michael Kimmel and Michael Flood and these various Michaels seems to have focused on when it comes to white men and boys is their so-called privilege, their male privilege and their white privilege. And it's been a very blaming discourse. The idea is that these men, their main issue is that they hurt others, they objectify women, they exert their dominance in oppressive ways, etc. So here at least he's trying to say, okay, but there is a whole cohort of white boys who actually deserve our empathy and who do have legitimate problems and issues. He mentions suicide later on, and he mentions, unemployment and these kinds of things. And so, I think it's maybe even an expression of the fact that he has been influenced by men's rights advocates to recognize that there is a whole range of issues that need to be addressed. And so he's trying to do that, even though he's totally imprisoned within the politically correct framework that, only really men of color, especially Black and brown men, are deserving of empathy. He has a hard time making the case for why we should extend empathy to white men and boys, but he's trying to do it within the very narrow framework that feminist theory allows him.
Yeah, I got the sense from that clip that he was mentioning these boys and basically saying, but you know what? In the end, they're going to be pushed into this hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah.
It's almost like he wasn't really empathetic with them. He was saying this is just another group that's going to be pushed by masculinity into being toxic.
Michael Kimmel had the same exact technique in his book, Angry White Men. He starts out with this sort of syrupy, feigned empathy for the experiences of men and boys.
Right.
And then as time goes by, the dialogue turns more blaming, more persecutory, more toxic toward the end. But you present first with this sort of fake empathy. I'm not buying that he gives a damn about the experience of young white poor men. I'm just not buying it at all.
So now he goes into this discussion of I mean, it is very truncated. Of course, he's only got 18 minutes, but he kind of overview of the experience of poor white, mostly rural. He's talking here about rural guys in the United States in particular. So let's look at what he says about them.
So go to number 3. All right, here we go.
But those rural areas have very few programs that might help a guy overcome the negative effects of poverty, leaving him with a strong sense that people need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. Whatever race or ethnicity he is, whatever his family's economic status, wherever he comes from, when our culture forces him to stay on the margins instead of being part of the mainstream, we limit his ability to earn a decent wage and thus fulfill one of the basic requirements of masculinity, providing for himself and any family he might have. Without that, he and we will probably never see him as man enough, and certainly not as a real man.
Go ahead,
Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was just grunting in disapproval.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. He's touching on he's touching on the consequences of deprivation, especially as experienced by poor white boys in rural areas in the United States. But he can't really get into it in any kind of thoroughgoing way because he's so limited by his philosophy. But I mean, one of the things he mentions is that these rural areas don't have very many programs that are going to enable young men to get out of poverty. Well, I mean, that I don't think anybody would disagree with that. That's a fairly safe kind of statement to make. But I mean, that it's so inadequate to the reality of the topic that it's almost useless. I mean, there are so many issues there around young men in rural areas in the United States, not least of which, of course, is the constant blaming and demonizing that they are subject to anytime they turn on CNN or open any mainstream newspaper or magazine. They're told that they are the root of all evil, and that everything that they value, from their love of sports to the kinds of pastimes that they take part in, to the way they speak, everything about them, their religion, if they happen to belong to an evangelical church, for example, just everything about them is toxic and has to be completely exterminated and remade from the bottom up. So there's that. And then there's also this implication that only through going to school can a young man find any future for himself. I mean, not all young men want to go to university or do whatever Dr. Smiler thinks he should do in order to better himself. And if he does go to school, whether it's even to a technical program or a community college or indeed to university, well, he's going to encounter a whole bunch of people like Smiler and like, Dr. Susanna Walters of Why Can't We Hate Men fame, a sociologist at Northeastern University, or hundreds, thousands probably, of anti-male feminist professors who are going to tell him he's no good. He's going to already have had feminist teachers at school, or at least mostly female and female-oriented teachers who believe that girls are the ones who should be encouraged to make something of themselves, and boys mainly to be suppressed and controlled, and who actually, it's now proven by a widespread OECD study, give boys lower grades simply as a matter of course because they are female oriented and biased against boys. So the problems that boys encounter with schooling, with ideas of bettering themselves, are largely the result of a gynocentric and feminist culture, and deserve a great deal more rigorous analysis than anything Smiler and any of his friends would be willing to give, and that in fact they themselves have been directly responsible for creating. So this clip really annoyed me deeply.
Yes, yeah.
I got something else on that too. I think Smiler Dr. Smiler should recognize, guess what? There really is male hierarchy. And guess what? It works.
Yeah.
Male hierarchy is exactly how pyramids got built and how we landed on the moon, and how Smiler can stand there and reach an audience of literally hundreds of people on the internet, which he has done with this video. I noticed they got 1 million subscribers to TEDx, and they got about 400 views on this video. But here's the thing. Yes, and I agree that in a system of hierarchy with men, which is what we do, you can try to change that all you want. Good luck. You're not going to have any luck with that. Right. There will be men slip through the cracks. There will be men who are harmed and affected negatively as a result of that hierarchy. There are men who kick down a few notches and men who ascend and achieve greatness. That's sort of way human males are wired. There's not much we can do about that. And I do think that the men's movement does, I think, a much better job than male feminists of recognizing the guys who have fallen through the cracks and appealing to them and trying to address their issues and their problems, their maybe their lack of success with women, maybe there's poor self-image of themselves for not measuring up to the standards of the hierarchy. We do a lot of talks about this, and we try to bring those men into the fold along with every other man on the planet. But his contention seems to be that you can somehow dismantle this hierarchy. Yeah. And my question is, how are you going to do that? By what mechanism will you ever? You put 3 men in a room, and 30 minutes later, there will be a pecking order. Yes. I guarantee
quickly
it happens. And guess what? That's life. Yes, you do sometimes have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Right. You do have to work hard in spite of adversity. That's what a lot of people would attribute masculinity as an asset in that pursuit. But he seems to think that we need participation awards for all men, and that we need to not have this hierarchy. That's crazy. It's crazy. If you want a society that devolves, then use Smiler's model.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you get. There and you see it. Look at the young men of Smiler's target audience. Look at these young, poor, fatherless guys who are getting all this supposed sensitivity training and indoctrination in our colleges. They're a mess, and they're out there on the streets committing violence, some of them. Where Smiler will never want to look at this, how Antifa is populated. They'll, if anything, he might attribute some of that to toxic masculinity, when we know for a fact that it's a lack of masculinity that adds to the
Exactly. Yeah, the thing that strikes me about this quote was just that, he is saying that all boys are out there under this net of masculinity where the culture is pushing them, forcing them into being toxic, when the exact opposite is almost true. It's the feminists and the male feminists and the culture itself that are literally condemning men for who they are. It's got it backwards. It's just backwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, man, the hierarchy is real. And that's one of the things that pisses me off about this whole thing with his talk, is that he's talking about what is masculinity, but he doesn't talk about testosterone research, which is instrumental in understanding men, because we now know that testosterone pushes men to strive for status, that is, be in the hierarchy. He doesn't say a word about precarious manhood, which is all about the world, women and men, pushing men to be able to succeed and condemning them if they don't. And he didn't say a word about moral typecasting, which shows very clearly that men get less compassion than women. Why would a man want to emote in public when he knows that he's going to get shamed for it? It's fucking crazy. It's crazy. Sure. You got to understand that men do not get this compassion. Women can bawl away in public because everyone's going to support them. Oh, poor dear. La, la, la. They're not going to say that about the guy.
No.
Anyway.
No, and it's typical that everything male feminists prescribe for young men to model and emulate is exactly what will get them rejected by women. I don't think that's an accident. I'm looking at Smiler right now. I think that you freeze framed at a perfect moment for him, because I believe that there stands a man who, were it not for hierarchy, would have had a lot more sexual interest from women. Sorry, that's the way I see it. I see this guy as a history of rejection, and now he's made a career out of trying to compensate for it. That's my 2-bit armchair psychoanalysis of this situation. But I see it. If you use that as a theory going into this, and then try to explain what he writes and how he behaves, it fits every step of the way to a guy who wants to be the one good man, who wants to be the one who is adored in the eyes of women. And guess what, Dr. Smiler? It'll never happen.
Indeed. Next clip.
Yep.
All right, let's see what we got.
So maybe that boy turns to sex and becomes a player in order to find some claim to being man enough. But without good access to birth control, or maybe with an explicit desire to get on welfare, he runs the risk of becoming a teen father. And like teen mothers, teen fathers are less likely to finish high school, less likely to start college, and less likely to finish it. By age 25, in fact, a teen father is more likely than other young men his age to be unemployed and to have been in jail.
Does he really think that the boys get the fucking welfare when they impregnate a young girl?
Explicit desire to get on welfare.
Yeah.
He doesn't even understand this. He understands nothing. Absolutely nothing.
I mean, most of the quote welfare out there is for women and children. And traditionally, it's neglected men horribly. From kicking out the black men who were at home so she could get the welfare check, up until today when the major programs are called, WIC, Women and Children, or something like that. I forget what it is.
It's WIC, Women, Infants, and Children.
Yeah, exactly.
And what he really overlooks here in a most glaring way is that what happens when a teen boy impregnates a girl, she gets the WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children. She gets the Section 8 housing. She gets the welfare checks. He gets the law coming after him for child support. And Smiler is standing there with that stupid look on his face, talking about how young boys impregnate girls so that they can get on welfare. What universe does this moron live in?
It's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. I mean, there's a whole other conversation to be had. I know you have to go, Paul, and so maybe we should take this up another time. But I was just astounded too. I mean, I was astounded by that statement about welfare. But this notion that men become young guys become players, as he calls them. I didn't even know that was a term anymore. But okay, we'll work with that. Young guys become players because they are insecure about their masculinity. They're trying to live up to some stereotype of manliness. I mean,
that's crazy. They become players because they're pushed to pair bond. It's just like everybody else.
I mean, most guys that I know and knew when I was growing up were interested in having a girlfriend. They weren't interested in becoming players. There are, of course, throughout history, there have been men who were players. He obviously knows nothing about history or literature. Otherwise, he wouldn't think this was some sort of invention post 1980s. There have always been men, Lotharios, Don Juans, whatever you want to call them, very well known, who made a career out of seducing women.
Yes.
My husband talks about who was himself a player, I have to say, and said that he the women came after him too. I mean, it takes two to tango. Is Dr. Smiler going to write a book about how women should stop being so promiscuous? And what's wrong with it exactly? But my husband talks about meeting Leonard Cohen when he was very young, who said at the point he'd already slept with 600 women. Was this because Leonard Cohen had an absence of masculinity and was trying to convince himself that he needed to live up to a masculine stereotype? Cohen himself would probably say he was pursuing something, the divine feminine, or I don't know what, a secular version of devotion to Mary, the mother of Jesus, or so. There's all sorts of complex ways one can speak about men and women and some men's obsession with indeed pursuing and having multiple affairs with hundreds of women. Is it a pathology? Well, there's lots of things to be said about that, but this notion that it's simply, again, biology plays a role too, I would expect. But this notion that it simply can be explained by a guy trying to live up to a stereotype is such an incredibly reductive way of understanding, the history of masculinity.
When men first start engaging in these behaviors, whether or not they're going to be a player or whatever, they don't even know what a stereotype means. They're just following their instincts to have sexual conquest, which is, got news for you, Smiler. That's a perfectly normal human behavior. It's healthy. It's good for you. It's wonderful. I think Dr. Smiler's next book should be How to Be a Loser and Sleep Alone. Because that's exactly what his prescription will give young men.
Seems like it.
Hard to argue with that.
Well, I know you have to go, Paul, so I'm wondering whether we should maybe wrap this up. There's still tons to talk about.
Yeah, I do have to run, unfortunately. I think we're about there anyway. I mean, we could always come back to Dr. Smiler anytime we need a go-to. He is a fountain of new material for us, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that he never mentions the significant number of men who suffer from incredible loneliness, who never have a sexual partner at all, or who have very, very few, and whose whole life, in some cases, is wasted worrying about that and wondering what's wrong with them, and being the good men.
That's a little too autobiographical.
Maybe, being the good men that he counsels Mike. That's all you have to be. Be generous, be empathetic, be loyal. Well, that is not really a sufficient answer to the many different problems that men face. Of course, he never mentions fatherlessness either throughout the entire discussion.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
Nor will he ever.
Yeah. And that's critical. Yeah. That's so critical.
Because that would be to blame women, or that would be to say that women have a role in the way our society is developing, that women have power, women have agency, women make choices that affect men. He'll never mention that. And that's really the heart of what's wrong with everything that he's saying here, and why I wouldn't trust a word that comes out of his mouth. And I would never sit with him in a counseling office.
I have to say that
for years, you scratch a male feminist, you find a misogynist underneath every time. No idea whatsoever of women's agency or autonomy, no respect for that, no willingness to give them the responsibility for their choices. Everything, every bit of blame, every bit of accountability must be removed from women and placed on men.
Yep.
And that is pathological, sick
thinking.
He
does that pretty well. I've gotten to believe that Andrew is a smiler, not a thinker.
I think that's a wonderful closing note.
Maybe that is a good way to stop.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't smile much in his video. Maybe
he doesn't.
Maybe he practiced and forgot to do it.
Yeah.
Well, he counsels that men should try to be good, and we here at Regarding Men believe that men
are
good.
Okay.
How many times in a row? Jeez. Doing good.
All right. Well, have a great week.
We'll see you then.
Take care, guys. I gotta run.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.